Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and I'm the preacher at the Mill Road Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And beside me is my good friend John Henry, who's the preacher at St. Leon.
I'm glad I'm your good friend.
All right. Yes, and he preaches at St. Leon there in Indiana. And we are the host of this program, and what we want to do is help as many people as possible to understand God's Word and to glorify Him in the things that we say and do. And if you have any questions or comments that might even help us, or a question that you would like for us to address on this program, please contact us. That information will be provided at the end of the program. And you'll also be given the opportunity to subscribe. And if you get the opportunity, please come out and visit with us. We would love to meet you, talk with you, that you can worship with us and see what we do and learn or even ask further questions. But we would love to be able to sit down with you and study from God's Word. And also, if you have any families or friends that would love a program like this, let them know about us. Thursday evenings at 7 p.m., Moments with the Master. John, what we have been doing as we've been talking about God's plan to redeem man, and we're now at the life of Joseph. And we left off with Joseph being in prison because he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife that he attempted to rape her, which he did not. It was her. She was pursuing him. And Joseph ran because he realized that to lay with her would be going against the will of God. And he didn't want to sin against God. And therefore, that kept him from doing wrong. But yes, he did suffer because of that false allegation, and he's put in prison. And so that brings us to chapter 40, where we continue to look at the life of Joseph. And what we see about him is this idea of dreams. And dreams are very important in the ancient world at this time. And in fact, it says in this chapter, God is introduced to the Egyptians as the God of dreams because he's going to be interpreting some dreams. And so in chapter 40, in regards to the interpretation of dreams, the pharaohs were recognized for that. But he's not going to be interpreting these dreams. And so it brings God into the picture, and he's going to be exalted through Joseph. And so as we begin to talk about this, I believe there will be some very valuable lessons to help us to see and learn how God is still active in the life of Joseph, and he's still active in our world today. We just have to trust that because the providence of God is still providing for those who seek to serve and do his will. And he also is there as punishing those who do evil as well. So God is still active in our world. And we think sometimes that he's so far apart, but not so. He's there. He's active. And so as we look at some of these things, that'll help us to understand that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you made, in the kind of introduction here. God is the God of dreams because, as they are down here in Egypt, for 400 years or so, when God goes to bring them out, Pharaoh's not going to let them go.
Right.
And God shows his superiority over their idol gods because they all worship over 1,000 gods, as I recall. And so and then Pharaoh, he thinks he's a god of some kind.
Right.
But yet you can see this this idea why God would be called the God of dreams. God is over all. God's going to show his superiority all through the Old Testament. I don't care what it is man comes up with.
That's right.
I don't care what man dreams up.
Yeah.
God's going to come out and show that he's superior.
That's right.
We talk about the idols. We talk about oracles.
Right.
New Testament, Peter said, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. Paul used that a couple times in the New Testament. Used in the Old Testament. Well, what you've got there, the oracles of an idol versus the oracles of God.
That's right.
And so that's a great point, I think, that you made about God being the God of dreams. And they're trying to interpret dreams, but they're going to get stuck on this one because, this is coming from God, and only God knows the answer, and it's no hocus pocus about it.
Exactly right. That's right. Awesome God. And in this chapter 40, is where Joseph is still being blessed by God. God is with him. He was with him as he was serving in Potiphar's house, and then he ends up in prison. But yet God is still with him because, remember, Joseph didn't do anything wrong. He still trusts God, and we're going to further see this. And so as he is placed in prison, in fact, the captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of the prisoners.
I think that's something that says a lot about Joseph right there.
Absolutely.
Because, he was in prison, then he was misrepresented by Potiphar's wife, and, and then, or he was a slave, and then he got thrown in prison. But these people these Egyptians that are around him, they can see. He don't have to say anything. He shows it by his life.
Absolutely.
And that's a good example for us today as Christians. We're to let our light shine. Right. Well, there you go. Yes. There's a good example right there of Joseph doing that.
Yeah, he didn't.
And people are seeing something in him.
Right.
It's not fake or anything.
That's right. And further showing that it's not fake is this thing comes upon him, and yet he still serves God.
Right.
How often people, I tried to do good, but these bad things happen, and so they end up walking away from God. But this is not the case with Joseph. He continues to do what is right, and God blesses him, and he puts him in charge of the prisoners. Now, in prison was a chief cupbearer to Pharaoh, and also the chief baker as well. And Joseph noticed how that they are downcasted in their view, and he wants to know what's going on. And here's that opportunity. What's happening? What's wrong? And it opens up this conversation, especially as he begins with the chief cupbearer. And for those who may not be familiar with what the chief cupbearers would do, is this would be the first line of defense if someone tried to poison the leader. And these guys would taste it. That's what they would. That was part of the responsibility, as well as making sure that everything was done well. But they also would taste it for the Pharaoh, and then he would end up drinking after the lead or the chief. If anything happened to the chief cupbearer, then they said, "Oh no, I'm not drinking that." But if everything was okay, then he would pursue or follow that.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was getting ready to mention that. But anyway, that's and that's true even today. Right. I believe we still have those kinds of things that go on. But you look at what the Bible. He's the chief. I mean, he's the head over. And so he's responsible for everybody. And like you said, the chief butler or baker or cupbearer, whatever, and they fall over, then
that's right.
I don't think I'd want that job. I don't know what you had to do to get it, but I don't think I'd want it.
So that becomes, that's their situation. And as Joseph approaches the chief cupbearer and ask him about that. And what the chief cupbearer does is he tells Joseph a dream that he had. And as he is talking with Joseph, telling him about the dream, in verse 9 is where he begins to explain to Joseph that dream. And let's look at some of those verses. He says, he told him the dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me. And on the vine were 3 branches, and as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cupbearer was in my hand, so that I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And then Joseph then turns around and he interprets this dream, as verse 12 tells us. And Joseph says that the 3 branches represent 3 days there in verse 12. And he says, within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your former custom when you were his cup bearer. And then notice Joseph points out there in verse 14, I believe is a key statement that he makes, and that is, only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. And that is, get me out of prison here, even though God is blessing him, but he doesn't want to be there. Matter of fact, he didn't do anything wrong to be there in the first place. So
yeah, but then there again, he asked that, but he gets out of prison. The cupbearer does, and he forgets all about Joseph. Right. It's just like, bye. See you later, buddy.
Right.
I'm getting out. You're still there, and I don't know as I'm gonna want to say anything about you. And we had talked about that before the program. And it's he's kind of like a fair weather friend. Joseph was kind to him and was able to tell him about the dream, which had good results. Right. And Joseph just asked for a little kindness or a favor in return.
That's right.
And he didn't even get that, because in chapter 41 we learn in verse 1, it was 2 full years, the Bible said, before the cupbearer finally spoke up and said, "Hey, I remember a guy 2 years ago when I was in
exactly.
when I was in prison."
And John, what's interesting is, here is the chief baker. He hears Joseph interprets the dream of the cupbearer, and he said, wait a minute now, if something good is happening with him, maybe I'm going to hear what he has to say about my dream. Yeah. Now, if Joseph has said something not favorable to the cupbearer, I wonder if he'd have said, wait a minute, I think I might keep this dream to myself. But because he hears the favorable interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, here come the chief baker, then he tells Joseph about his dream there in verse 16 and following. And it says, when the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. And the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Now here's Joseph's interpretation of the chief baker's dream. He says the 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off you. Can you imagine hearing that?
Yeah, well, it's just like you said, he heard that good interpretation. It's just like you can vision him. Oh, me next.
Right. Yes.
And it didn't go so well, his interpretation.
That's exactly right.
So he didn't have anything to look forward to.
Absolutely. And then everything happened exactly like Joseph had said, as God had revealed to Joseph the interpretation of these dreams. You do have the chief cupbearer being restored back to serving Pharaoh.
And another thing about all this, we all need to see is that Joseph always gave the honor and the glory to God. Now, what do you think would have happened if Joseph, put on a big display and he acted like, hey, I'm the one that's behind all that? Well, it would have stopped.
Right.
No doubt about God would have stopped it, because, God hates that kind of character in a man that's arrogant or acts like, he can do all these things. He's above God, or he sits in the seat of God. But, that is a hard lesson for man to learn.
It is.
Man does not sit in the seat of God. Man is the creature. God's the creator.
Absolutely.
But I'm really impressed with Joseph and the way he exalts God. He never takes the credit for anything. He always tells them, this is coming from God.
That's right.
The God I serve. And whereas, the majority of men have this mentality, look what I did.
Right.
No, it's look what God did.
Absolutely. And so you are impressed with Joseph, and you could see as he is being used as an instrument to glorify God. And as we started out here in chapter 40, God is being exalted through, as you pointed out, through Joseph. And that's a very important lesson, that God is the one whom we should give all the praise, honor, and glory to. And when things don't go our way, we still need to trust him, because he knows what is best. That's why he is to be recognized as God. Right. So a very good point and lesson that we need to learn, and Joseph surely shows us these things. Okay. And that brings us to chapter 41.
Well, let's
unless you got something.
Well, I want to look at this for a minute. I think
go ahead.
let's the last couple verses. What's interesting to me is when the third day comes, it's Pharaoh's birthday.
Yes.
And so he's making this great feast, and so during the time of this feast is when the chief the chief butler and the chief baker, it said, were among the servants. And of course the chief butler, or the cupbearer, was restored, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, verse 21, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. And in verse 23, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but it says he forgot him. And what I think is kind of interesting, Albert, that these birthday parties must have really been a big bash, because it seems like a lot of people lost their heads. You remember in the New Testament there was John the Baptist.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so, just kind of being a little lighthearted there. But anyway, I just think it's interesting that, here's a birthday and here's what I'm going to do. Right. I'm going to whack someone's head off. But it came true to what Joseph had said,
That's right.
So that points out that what Joseph said was true. It came to be. His head was cut off.
That's exactly what happened. That picture just shows us again of how God is in control of this, and showing us these things that we need to trust. When God says or when God speaks, we need to trust that.
Yeah.
It's surely going to be as He says it will. And in this case, like I said, He speaks through Joseph in interpreting these dreams.
I think that's a good point you made. When God says it's going to be as He says.
Yeah.
Because, God said, here's what's going to happen to you.
Yes.
And it came, and it's, it came true. But it's like people today, we read the Bible, God says, but we act like, I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
But hey, we better learn some lessons.
Absolutely.
Because God's going to do what He said. If God said He's going to do this, if God says, if you don't obey me and keep my commandments, I'm going to send you to eternal torment. Well, hey, that's exactly what God means.
That's right.
But we've got people today that say, well, that's not really what God meant. Well, if you get a chance sometime to talk to this butler, well, you need to ask him.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. And we need to find out what God's will is on matters that are what He's pleased with. We cannot decide for God.
Right. That's a good point, too.
We have to listen to what He says and do it His way. If we don't do it His way, then what's going to happen is we're going to suffer the consequences. And those consequences are grave. Right. And that's our point in study, of spending moments with the master to listen to what the master says so that we will be obedient to those things, because they are very important. Our souls hang in the balances based upon what is revealed to us from his word.
Okay, now we can go on to 41.
Right. Now, chapter 41. Yeah, chapter 41 then really brings God in the center of the study, because Pharaoh cannot interpret those dreams. He can't interpret his dreams.
Yeah.
So what that does, it really diminishes Pharaoh. But God is exalted through Joseph, who is able to do this. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how God's providence, and God will be exalted. God will be found to be telling the truth. And so those are some very important facts and realities that we need to deal with. And chapter 41 brings this to our attention. So now it is Pharaoh who is going to have a dream. And he's going to call all kinds of, tell me what, interpret this for me. Yeah. And look at the first few verses of chapter 41 tells us what the dream that Pharaoh had. He says, now it happened, it says, at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt. In other words, they were lean of flesh. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And it says, the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. You can imagine. Wait a minute.
I'm trying to imagine.
It's
kind of funny.
It's exactly right. And then at the same time, it's like, wait a minute.
That would be like waking up and saying, man, that was some dream I had.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the 7 skinny, would be what we call skinny or lean cows, eat the fat cows.
Yeah. That's backwards, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Well, kind of.
And so here, Pharaoh wakes up, and then it tells us when he awake, he fell asleep and dreamed a second time.
Yeah.
And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. And then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh woke, and behold, it was a dream. It's sort of like sometimes our dreams can be so real. It seems like it just really, literally happened. I remember one time I had a dream about a dog biting me, and I woke up, and I could feel the pain, like as though the dog did bite. And that's why Pharaoh, this thing is as real could be to him. And so we're told that when he awakes, it was.
I've experienced them also.
Yes.
You know, you have a dream and it's so real. You wake up and you're you're thinking for a minute, did that really happen? Or
right.
Yes. And then like he did, you have a bad dream. You wake up and it seems real. Then all of a sudden, you're kind of in a haze. You go back to sleep trying to forget it. Now you have one maybe worse than the first one.
Right, exactly.
And so he, like you said, he's had these 2 pretty wild dreams here.
And sometimes these dreams can, as it did with Pharaoh here, it tells us in verse 8 that when he wakes up now in the morning, his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. And so here he's thinking through these things, and he's troubled by them. And again, as we said earlier in chapter 40, dreams were a very important part of the ancient world, the interpretation of them. And you could see in chapter 40 and now here in chapter 41 and he's troubled by this. I need to get some answers. And so he's calling his magicians, his wise men, to tell them, and they can't do it. They can't. They don't know the interpretation.
You know, that's kind of funny when you think about that, because evidently they was, to me, you know, probably just a regular dream that somebody has. You know, you can even make up a story, a good story, and sell it. Yes. But this, they didn't know what to do with it.
Right, absolutely.
I think that's the problem here.
And they probably was aware of the birthday party that took place, or these birthday parties that take place. And if you don't do what is right, you could lose your head. and so, again, that puts a lot of pressure on these magicians, these so-called wise men, trying to figure these things out. And so it puts them in a terrible fix here. So
they remember, you know, the baker, the cupbearer, the cupbearer finally remembers, hey, Pharaoh, I got some information for you. I made him look good, didn't it?
Yeah, sure did.
There was a guy back here that interpreted 2 years ago and told me what was going to happen.
And so he remembers, and he tells Pharaoh about that. And they summon for Joseph, and we're told as you begin to read through all of this, in verse 12 it says, "Now a Hebrew youth was with us there," as the chief baker is talking about these things, and as he points out to him, who interprets dreams, and then they bring him in so that the Pharaoh's dream could be interpreted here. So again, you start to see 2 years ago, you start to think about this for a moment. I wanted to put us in Joseph's shoes for a moment.
Yeah.
You interpret dreams 2 years ago, and you tell the one who is going to be restored if he will remember you. And he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
What questions would rise in your mind? I know some questions would rise in mine, and one of them would be, what have I done to deserve this?
Oh, well, yeah.
That I would, you know, I'm doing what's right. I'm in charge of the prisoners. No one's looking over my shoulder. And I interpret the dreams by God's revelation to me. And I just want to get out of here. And yet, I'm here 2 full years. You know, what have I done to deserve this? And there are others who would say, is there really a God? And you could see those kinds of things would be very challenging. And then now, as he has been summoned to think before Pharaoh at this time, how many people would have given up and say, hey, there is no God? And then coming before Pharaoh to interpret the dream, would they trust God that good things are going to happen to them? And there's a lot of people who have
lose their faith.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, that would be kind of scary. I mean, you know, because you hadn't heard anything for 2 years, and all of a sudden you're summoned. And I'm just guessing, just the way people are. I would imagine when they went to get him, you know, he probably maybe asked the guard, and the guard said, Pharaoh wants you in there pronto.
Right.
Front and center.
Right, front and center.
And he's got some dreams that he wants you to interpret.
Yeah.
And, you know, but because of his character, but still, when he's a young man, and we saw that with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob when they were young in the faith, and the mistakes that they made. Absolutely. And the things, you know, that were going through their mind. I'm sure this is no different.
Right.
It happens to us.
Right, it does.
And it happened, I would say it happened to Joseph also. You know, he had to have some concern, I would think, to a degree, as to what's going to happen to me here.
Right. And you know, John, because our time is fastly approaching to the end, I think that's a good place to stop and to whet the appetites of those of us who have been spending moments with the Master to learn more, so that you tune in next Thursday at 7 p.m.
You wouldn't do that to them, would you?
Oh, yes, I would, because I love spending moments with the Master. I hope that you have too, my friend, because we certainly have enjoyed it.
Sure.
John, any other further thoughts?
No, I don't. No, just like you said. Be here next Thursday at 7.
All right, my friend.
We'll continue.
Absolutely. And you have a blessed day as you continue to study God's Word, and may you grow in your faith towards Him.